I learned early that love in my family had a price, and somehow I was always the one expected to pay it. While my parents erased my brother's debts like they never existed, I was drowning alone. Until the truth finally broke me and then rebuilt. My name is Esther, and I learned favoritism meant the night my parents paid my brother's debt while I pretended my overdue bills not exist. Ryan laughed at the table and said it was temporary, and my parents nodded quickly like money was an inconvenience instead of a repeated rescue. I sat quietly and listened while my mother said responsibility builds character, and my father added that struggle makes people stronger when faced alone daily. I asked, "Can you help me too?" And my mother frowned and said I should budget better and stop comparing myself to others constantly anymore. Ryan shrugged and said he would pay them back soon, and my parents smiled like promises counted more than history ever really did for him. I remembered being younger and watching emergencies follow Ryan, while I learned how to fix problems silently without asking anyone for help or comfort ever. My father once said, "You are the responsible one," and I thought responsibility meant being forgotten, while others were rescued, praised, protected first, always instead. Maya noticed my silence and whispered, "This isn't fair," and I told her fairness never lived here the way people pretend it should exist anyway. When bills piled up, I worked extra shifts and skipped meals, while my parents wired money to Ryan without questions, hesitation, lectures, guilt, limits. Conditions. I asked my father once, "Why does he get help?" And he said because Ryan needs it more right now, again, today, apparently, always, forever. My mother added, "You are stronger," and I realized strength was their excuse for neglect dressed as praise, patience, maturity, silence, obedience, endurance, sacrifice, love. At family dinners, they joked about Ryan's bad luck, while my stress became invisible background noise nobody questioned, addressed, fixed, noticed, validated, helped, acknowledged. I tried explaining my situation calmly, but every concern was called complaining, bitterness, or jealousy instead of being heard, believed, respected, supported, understood, valued. Equally. Ryan teased me and said, "Relax, it will work out," because it always did for him with help. Money, forgiveness, excuses, safety, comfort, family, rescue. My parents framed this pattern as balance, but balance never asked one child to bleed. Quietly, repeatedly, endlessly, alone, unnoticed, unloved, unsupported, unequal, unseen, unfixed. I lay awake nights counting expenses, while Ryan slept knowing consequences would never reach him because my parents stood between him and reality. Always, consistently. I stopped asking for help because rejection hurt worse when it came from family who promised love, fairness, safety, support, care, protection, loyalty, trust, belonging. Maya said, "You deserve support too," and I cried because I believed her words more than my parents' explanations, excuses, defenses, justifications, lectures, silence, denial. I watched my parents celebrate Ryan's survival while my endurance became expected and unremarkable, daily, routinely, consistently, unquestioned, normalized, accepted, justified, defended, praised, demanded, required. I finally understood my struggles were not unseen. They were simply acceptable to them because they believed I could handle more pain, pressure, neglect, imbalance. That realization hurt more than poverty, because it stripped hope away, completely, suddenly, cruelly, quietly, deeply, personally, permanently, painfully, sharply, undeniably, forever. Inside me alone, I looked at my parents and saw certainty, not concern, in their eyes when they defended favoritism, imbalance, excuses, habits, comfort, tradition, control, bias, choice. Ryan thanked them again, and nobody thanked me for surviving quietly, daily, independently, painfully, patiently, endlessly, without rescue, support, relief, praise, comfort, money, help, mercy. I realized my name was never on the receipt, only his, because my parents chose favorites, roles, expectations, sacrifices, outcomes, narratives, excuses, protection, inequality, control. This truth settled slowly, heavy and cold, and resentment finally had clarity instead of confusion, doubt, denial, excuses, hope, questions, pleading, waiting, wishing, praying, believing. I wasn't angry yet, just wounded enough to stop pretending everything was fair, equal, loving, balanced, healthy, reasonable, normal. acceptable, sustainable, kind, protective, mutual, deserved. I said nothing that night, because silence felt safer than breaking their illusion. Comfort, denial, habits, patterns, routines, expectations, authority, peace, control, narrative, power, grip, but something inside me shifted, quietly, permanently, reshaping how I saw love, fairness, family, money, loyalty, worth, survival, patience, endurance, boundaries, power, choice, dignity, self. I understood that night I would never be rescued here regardless of effort, pain, honesty, struggle, need, exhaustion, fear, hope, loyalty, obedience, silence, sacrifice, tears. That knowledge hurt deeply, but it also hardened me into something stronger, clearer, quieter, steadier, more aware, less hopeful, more prepared, grounded, resolved, realistic, awake. And that was when confusion ended, and survival truly began without approval, permission. Rescue, fairness, comfort, excuses, illusions, denial, apologies, dependence, pleading, bargaining, waiting, faith. I realized the pattern had teeth. The morning my rent reminder buzzed while my parents were wiring money to Ryan again, I called my mother and said, "I'm short this month," and she replied, "You'll figure it out." Before mentioning Ryan's credit card balance, my father added, "He made a mistake," and I asked, "So did I?" But neither of them answered that. At dinner Ryan joked, "Adulting is hard." And my parents laughed while I counted my remaining dollars silently. I said, "I'm behind on bills." And my mother said, "You should be more careful, like careful paid medical copays." Ryan said, "It's just a rough patch," and my father replied, "That's why family helps." And I felt invisible again. I asked, "Does that include me?" And my mother frowned and said, "Don't turn this into competition." Maya texted under the table, "They're doing it again," and I typed, "I know," with shaking hands. A bank alert popped up later, and I stared at the screen until numbers blurred together. I remembered being 13 and hearing Ryan just needs more time, while I learned to manage without anything extra. When Ryan quit another job, my parents called it burnout. When I worked 2 jobs, they called it ambition. I asked my father, "Why is his debt an emergency and mine a lesson?" And he said, "You're stronger." That word felt like a sentence. My mother said, "Ryan learns by failing," and I asked, "What do I learn by struggling?" And she said, "Resilience." I didn't want resilience, I wanted help. Ryan asked me for gas money once, and my parents handed him cash before I could respond. I said nothing, because saying something always made things worse. Maya said later, "This is not normal." And I replied, "It's familiar." Bills stacked on my counter like proof I wasn't imagining things. I skipped appointments, delayed payments, and told myself this was temporary. Ryan bought something new and said, "Don't judge me," and my parents defended him before I spoke. I said, "I'm not judging," and my father replied, "Then stop sounding bitter." That hurt more than the refusal. I tried explaining calmly and said, "I need help this once." And my mother said, "If we help you, you'll depend on us." I stared at her and asked, "What do you think Ryan does?" And she said, "That's different." Different was their favorite word. I remembered childhood moments lining up like evidence. Every time Ryan was rescued and I was praised for coping. I cried alone in my car after another dinner, gripping the steering wheel until my hands hurt. Maya called and said, "You're allowed to be angry," and I said, "I'm exhausted." Ryan texted later, "Thanks for understanding," and I deleted it without replying. My parents framed generosity toward him as love, and restraint toward me as trust. I asked my father, "What happens if I fail?" And he said, "You won't." Like failure was only allowed for one child. That night I broke down on my kitchen floor and whispered, "I can't keep doing this." Maya stayed on the phone and said, "Stop paying the price for his mistakes," and I cried harder. I realized self-reliance wasn't something they admired, it was something they required from me. Ryan called and said they're helping me again, and I replied, "I know, because I always did." My parents never asked how much I could carry, only how long. I stopped expecting fairness, but the hurt still surprised me. I looked at my bank account and then at old family photos, wondering where I went wrong. The answer came quietly. I didn't. They paid his mistakes, and I paid the price because that was the role they chose for me. And that night, At my lowest point, I finally admitted something I had avoided for years. This wasn't about money. It was about worth. The day it finally broke wasn't loud, it was quiet, and that scared me more than any argument ever had before. My father said, "Ryan needs help again." And I asked, "What about me?" Already knowing the answer. My mother replied, "This isn't the time," and I said, "It's never the time," and my voice didn't shake. Ryan leaned back and said, "Why are you making this a thing?" And I looked at him and said, "Because it's always been a thing." My father sighed and said, "You're being unfair," and I replied, "No, I'm being honest." My mother said, "We can't let him fail," and I asked, why was I allowed to? Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable, and nobody rushed to fill it this time. Ryan scoffed and said, "You're overreacting," and I answered, "You're underaccountable." My father raised his voice and said, "Watch your tone," and I said, "Watch your pattern." My mother said, "We raised you both the same," and I laughed once and said, "That's the lie you tell yourselves." Ryan said, "I didn't ask to be helped," and I replied, "You never had to." My father said, "Enough," and I realized he meant enough truth, not enough pain. I stood up and said, "I'm done explaining myself." And my mother asked, "Where are you going?" I answered, "Somewhere I don't have to compete for basic care." Ryan said, "You'll regret this." And I replied, "I already regret staying." I walked out without slamming the door, because I didn't need drama to make my point. Maya answered on the first ring and said, "Did it happen?" And I said, "I'm done." She replied, "Come over," and I said, "I'm on my way." On her couch, I said, "I don't think they'll ever choose me," and she answered, "Then stop auditioning." That sentence hit harder than anything my parents ever said. Maya said, "You don't need their permission to live," and I replied, "I forgot that." She handed me a card and said, "Call Ben," and I asked, "Why?" She said, "Because rebuilding doesn't start with anger, it starts with clarity." Ben listened while I talked, really listened, and then said, "You've been carrying weight that isn't yours." I asked, "What do I do?" and he replied, "You build boundaries and let consequences teach." I said, "That feels selfish," and he answered, "That's conditioning, not truth." For the first time, someone named it without softening it. I stopped answering my parents' calls immediately. I stopped explaining my choices. I stopped justifying my exhaustion. When my mother said, "You're pulling away," I replied, "I'm standing still." My father said, "Family sticks together," and I answered, "Not at my expense anymore." Ryan texted, "This is dramatic," and I didn't reply. The space felt strange at first, like standing without leaning on something familiar but harmful. Maya said, "How do you feel?" and I said, "Lighter and terrified." She smiled and said, "That's growth." Ben helped me make a plan, one that didn't include rescuing anyone but myself. I paid attention to my own numbers, my own limits, my own needs. I realized how much energy I had wasted trying to be equal in a system designed to keep me smaller. One night my mother said, "We miss you," and I replied, "I miss being respected." She didn't answer. That silence told me everything. I noticed Ryan struggling more without constant rescue, and I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because he was failing, but because it was finally his lesson. I stopped hoping for fairness and started choosing peace. I stopped competing with a favorite and started standing alone. That was the real shift, not anger, not revenge, but withdrawal. I didn't need them to approve of me anymore. I approved of myself. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The call came late, and I knew before answering that something had finally broken on their side. My mother said, "We need to talk," and I replied, "About what?" Already steady. She hesitated and said, "Ryan is in trouble," and I waited without rushing to fill the silence. My father took the phone and said, "We can't cover this one," and I answered, "I'm sorry to hear that." He paused and said, "We thought you might help," and I felt the weight of years press forward. I asked, "Help how?" even though I knew. My mother said, "Just this once," and I replied, "That's what you always said to me." Ryan grabbed the phone and said, "Don't make this personal," and I answered, "It's always been personal." He scoffed and said, "You're being cold," and I replied, "I'm being consistent." My father said, "Family helps family," and I asked who helped me. No one answered. That silence felt different this time, heavier, because it wasn't chosen. My mother whispered, "We didn't realize how bad it was," and I said, "You realized. You just accepted it?" She cried and said, "We tried our best," and I replied, "Your best had a favorite." Ryan said, "I just need a chance," and I answered, "So did I." My father said, "You're really going to turn your back?" And I replied, I turned toward myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain my budget or my boundaries. I simply said, "I can't fix this for you." Ryan laughed bitterly and said, "You think you're better now?" And I answered, "I think I'm done." After the call, Maya asked, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I feel clear." She smiled and said, "That's strength," and I believed her. Days passed, and I heard through relatives that my parents were struggling. They sold things. They argued. They stopped pretending everything was fine. My father called again and said, "We didn't know how much we leaned on you." And I replied, "You leaned without asking." My mother said, "We miss you." And I answered, "I miss being treated equally." She said, "We're listening now." And I replied, "That matters, but it doesn't erase." Ryan stopped calling. I didn't chase him. For the first time, his consequences were his. I focused on my own life, my own bills, my own peace. I cooked meals without anxiety and slept without checking my phone. Maya said, "You look settled." And I replied, "I stopped bracing for disappointment." My parents asked to meet, and I agreed on my terms. At the table, my father said, "We failed you." And I nodded. My mother said, "We didn't mean to." And I replied, "Intent doesn't cancel impact." They listened, really listened, without interrupting, correcting, or defending. That alone felt like closure. Ryan didn't come. I wasn't surprised. I didn't need him there to finish my story. My father asked, "Can we rebuild?" And I answered slowly, honestly, without expectations. My mother reached for my hand, and this time I didn't pull away. I said, "I won't rescue anyone anymore." And they nodded. When I left, the air felt lighter than it ever had. I walked home alone and smiled at the quiet. I built routines that felt like care instead of survival. I planned without fear and saved without shame. Ryan's shine faded without constant rescue, and I felt no joy in it. Only acceptance. He was learning what I had learned long ago. My parents adjusted, awkwardly, painfully, but genuinely. They asked before assuming. They listened before correcting. They waited instead of demanding. I didn't rush forgiveness. I let trust grow slowly, like it should have from the beginning. One evening Maya asked, "Do you feel free?" And I said, "I feel aligned." That felt better than freedom. I didn't lose my family. I lost the role they assigned me. The fixer, the strong one, the one who never needed help. Losing that role gave me room to breathe, rest, and choose. When I looked back, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt clarity. I survived without rescue, and now I lived without permission. That was the real victory, not watching someone fall, but finally standing without carrying anyone else's weight. As I closed my door that night, I said my name quietly and smiled. Esther. Just Esther. And for the first time, that was more than enough.